From Stanford University in California, this is Democracy Now!
We also need the best protection of classified information. That is the worst situation. Hillary's private email scandal, which put our classified information in the reach of our enemies, disqualifies her from the presidency.
After campaigning for the presidency, vowing to protect the nation's secrets, President Trump is facing a major new scandal. The Washington Post reports he revealed highly classified intelligence to Russian diplomats at the White House. Even Senate Republicans are now warning Trump is in a downward spiral. We'll get the latest. Then, as the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals hears arguments over Trump's second Muslim travel ban, we'll go to Seattle to speak with Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson. He filed the very first lawsuit against Trump's travel ban, sparking a nationwide firestorm of legal resistance.
We are a nation of laws. And as we have said from day one, that those laws apply to everybody in our country, and that includes the President of the United States.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The beginning of the end. That's what many are saying about the Trump presidency following the Washington Post's explosive expose revealing how President Trump disclosed highly classified intelligence during his sit-down meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak at the White House last week. Only one day after Trump fired FBI Director James Comey over his investigation into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia to influence the 2016 election. Citing unnamed U.S. officials, the Post reports Trump began bragging to the two Russian officials about his intelligence briefings, saying, quote, "I get great intel. I have people brief me on great intel every day." Trump went on to disclose highly classified information provided by a third party about the possible threat of ISIS launching an attack on an airplane using a computer bomb. This is the Washington Post's Greg Miller, one of the co-authors of the article.
At some point, Trump starts talking about the great intelligence he gets. He's telling his visitors, I get the best briefings, I get the best intelligence, and proceeds to talk about this threat that is underway that has been actually publicly talked about for some time. But he goes into details about the specifics of this plot and how it's coming together and what the Islamic State is doing to try to pull this off. And the problem is that the United States knows much of this information because of intelligence that came from a partner, another country.
Senior White House officials were apparently so alarmed by Trump's disclosures they called the CIA and National Security Agency afterward to warn them of what had happened. Officials told the Washington Post they were concerned Trump's disclosure would jeopardize a critical source of intelligence on the Islamic State. There's been some speculation that the country of Jordan was the source of the classified intelligence. President Trump is reportedly scheduled to speak by phone this morning with Jordan's King Abdullah. At an emergency news conference Monday, National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster said the Washington Post story was false.
The story that came out tonight, as reported, is false. The President and the Foreign Minister reviewed a range of common threats to our two countries, including threats to civil aviation. At no time were intelligence sources or methods discussed. And the President did not disclose any military operations that were not already publicly known.
But earlier this morning, President Trump made his first comment on the story, in which he appears to contradict General McMaster and instead confirms he did disclose information to Russia. He wrote on Twitter, quote, "As president, I wanted to share with Russia at an openly scheduled White House meeting, which I have the absolute right to do, facts pertaining to terrorism and airline flight safety. Humanitarian reasons, plus I want Russia to greatly step up their fight against ISIS and terrorism." We'll have more on Trump's leaks to Russia after headlines with Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution here at Stanford University and with Scott Horton, lecturer at Columbia Law School, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine. The journalistic monitoring group Air Wars says up to 100 civilians were reportedly killed by U.S.-led coalition airstrikes in Iraq's Anbar province Saturday. Residents say the airstrikes continued for 4 hours and hit an internet hall, multiple homes, a stadium, and a cemetery where a funeral of an ISIS fighter was being held. Meanwhile, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says U.S. airstrikes killed at least 30 people, including more than a dozen children, in Syria's eastern province of Deir az-Zor Monday. This comes after U.S. airstrikes on May 11th reportedly killed at least a dozen civilians, including 8 children, north of the Syrian city of Raqqa. 2 days earlier, airstrikes on 2 villages around Raqqa reportedly killed 19 civilians, including at least 5 children. In more news on Syria, the U.S. State Department says it believes the Syrian government's been burning the bodies of those killed at the Sadnaya prison outside Damascus in a crematorium. Amnesty International says the Syrian government has executed up to 13,000 people at the prison since 2011. Physicians for Human Rights said, quote, if shown to be true, the Syrian government's use of a crematorium demonstrates the extent to which the Syrian government has become a machine that commits mass murder with impunity, unquote. In Yemen, the death toll from a cholera outbreak has risen to 187, as the U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign has devastated Yemen's health, water, sewage, and sanitation systems. There are more than 11,000 reported cases of cholera in Yemen, and the International Committee for the Red Cross warns the disease is spreading like wildfire. In Afghanistan, 5 children between the ages of 6 and 10 were killed Sunday when a mortar round exploded as the children were playing cricket. The mortar round was likely fired amidst fighting earlier in the day, but did not explode until the children were playing. The United Nations says fighting in Afghanistan has killed 283 children so far this year. In Mexico, the award-winning journalist Javier Valdez has been assassinated in the northwestern state of Sinaloa. Valdez was a long-time reporter on drug trafficking and organized crime. He wrote for the prominent newspaper La Jornada. He was killed on Monday after armed gunmen opened fire on his car in the city of Culiacan. This is Valdez speaking in 2011 when he won the Committee to Protect Journalists International Press Freedom Award.
I've been a journalist for 21 years, and never before have I suffered and enjoyed it this intensely, nor with so many dangers. In Culiacan, in the state of Sinaloa, in Mexico, it's a danger to be alive. And to be a journalist is to tread an invisible line determined by the bad guys, who are in drug trafficking and the government, in a field strewn with explosives. This is what most of the country is living through. One must protect oneself from everything and everyone, and there does not seem to be options or salvation, and often there is no one to turn to.
His death marks the 5th reported killing of a journalist in Mexico this year. Only hours after his assassination, gunmen opened fire on another journalist, Sonia Córdoba, and her son, Jonathan Rodriguez Córdoba, in the state of Jalisco. Córdoba is the deputy director of the weekly magazine El Costeño. She survived the attack, is in critical condition. Her son, who also wrote for the magazine, was killed. Mexico is one of the world's most dangerous places to be a journalist. Since 2000, more than 100 journalists have been murdered in Mexico. President Trump is meeting with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan today at the White House. Today's meeting comes amidst tension between U.S. and Turkey over the Pentagon's arming of the Syrian Kurdish militia. During today's meeting, Trump and Erdogan are not expected to discuss the deteriorating human rights situation inside Turkey, where nearly 50,000 people have been arrested, 150,000 public and private workers have been fired, and more than 150 journalists have been imprisoned since last summer's failed military coup. In Seattle, Washington, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals heard arguments Monday over Trump's second Muslim ban, which sought to ban all refugees and citizens of 6 majority Muslim nations from entering the United States. 2 months ago, a federal judge in Hawaii blocked Trump's revised ban just hours before it was slated to take effect nationwide. This is Neil Katyal, a lawyer representing the state of Hawaii.
The government has not engaged in mass dragnet exclusions, in the past, 50 years. This is something new and unusual, in which you're saying this whole class of people, some of which are dangerous, we can bar them all.
We'll go to Seattle later in the broadcast to speak with Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who filed the first lawsuit against Trump's Muslim travel ban. In more international news, in Japan, thousands of people protested against U.S. military bases on the island of Okinawa Monday as the island marked 45th anniversary of its reversion to Japanese rule. The protesters gathered on the shores near Hanoko to protest a highly controversial new U.S. military base, which began construction in April after years of opposition from residents. For decades, residents have called for the expulsion of U.S. troops from Okinawa, which houses about two-thirds of the 50,000 U.S. troops currently stationed in Japan. In El Salvador, the United Nations is calling for an investigation into a string of killings of transgender women. Local LGBTQ groups say at least 17 transgender women have been killed so far this year in El Salvador. The Trump administration said Monday it would vastly expand the so-called global gag rule, a Reagan-era policy that bans U.S. funding for any international health care organization that performs abortion or advocates for the legalization of abortion or even mentions abortion, even if those activities are funded by non-U.S. money. The expansion of the global gag rule is expected to affect hundreds of health clinics worldwide, particularly in Africa. The U.S. Supreme Court has dealt a major victory for voting rights activists after it refused to hear an appeal over North Carolina's voter suppression law. Last year, a federal appeals court blocked the law, ruling the measures discriminate against African-American voters and target them with almost surgical precision. On Monday, the Supreme Court announced it would not hear a challenge to the appeals court ruling, meaning the highly restrictive voter ID law will not be reinstated. In Bakersfield, California, dozens of farm workers are recovering after they were exposed to a highly toxic pesticide whose use was recently green-lighted by the EPA in one of the agency's first decisions since Trump took office. Last year, the EPA was on the verge of banning the Dow Chemical Company pesticide, but under EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, the agency unexpectedly reversed course and approved its use. Multiple studies have found the pesticide causes both immediate symptoms, such as vomiting, diarrhea, and blurred vision, as well as long-term damage in children, such as developmental delays and higher rates of autism. And in West Virginia, former police officer Stephen Mader is suing the city of Weirton after he says he was fired from the police department for not shooting a suicidal young man. In May 2016, Officer Mader arrived at the house of a 23-year-old African-American man named Ronald R.J. Williams, Jr., after Williams' girlfriend called the police because he'd threatened to hurt himself. Officer Mader says he found Williams holding a handgun and acting suicidal. Mader says he was trying to de-escalate the situation and was urging Williams to put down the gun when two more police officers arrived. One immediately opened fire, killing Williams. The police later found Williams' gun was not loaded. Officer Mader says 1 month later he was informed he would be fired for, quote, apparent difficulties in critical incident reasoning, unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Stanford University in California. President Trump has appeared to confirm parts of a bombshell Washington Post story that he disclosed highly classified intelligence last week to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak last week during a meeting at the White House. Earlier this morning, Trump tweeted, quote, as president, I wanted to share with Russia at an openly scheduled White House meeting, which I have the absolute right to do, facts pertaining to terrorism and airline flight safety, humanitarian reasons, plus I want Russia to greatly step up their fight against ISIS and terrorism, the president tweeted. Trump's comment appears to contradict statements from top administration officials last night who claimed the Washington Post report was false. According to the paper, Trump disclosed highly classified intelligence, what's known as code name information, about the possible threat of ISIS launching an attack on an airplane using a computer bomb. This is the Washington Post's Greg Miller, one of the co-authors of the article.
At some point, Trump starts talking about the great intelligence he gets. He's telling his visitors, I get the best briefings, I get the best intelligence, and proceeds to talk about this threat that is underway that you know, has been actually publicly talked about for some time. But he goes into details about the specifics of this plot and how it's coming together and what the Islamic State is doing to try to pull this off. And the problem is that the United States knows much of this information because of intelligence that came from a partner, another country. I mean, you have his own National Security Council staff members, senior officials who see readouts of what happened. They call the CIA director, call the NSA chief to warn them, look, something happened in this meeting with the Russians we need to tell you about. This is in part because they're alarmed and concerned about the blowback. These are agencies, the CIA, that would be directly communicating or dealing with this foreign partner, and they would be most concerned about that relationship going south.
Senior White House officials were apparently so alarmed by Trump's disclosures that they called the CIA and National Security Agency afterward to warn them of what had happened. Officials said they were concerned Trump's disclosure would jeopardize a critical source of intelligence on the Islamic State. There's been some speculation that the country of Jordan was the source of the classified intelligence. President Trump's reportedly scheduled to speak by phone this morning with Jordan's King Abdullah. One current U.S. official told BuzzFeed the situation is, quote, far worse than what has already been reported. To talk more about the story, we're joined by two guests. In London, Scott Horton's with us, lecturer at Columbia Law School and contributing editor at Harper's Magazine, author of Lords of Secrecy, The National Security Elite and America's Stealth Warfare. Here at Stanford University, Larry Diamond is with us from the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He has served as senior advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad at the invitation of National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. Back in 2004, he blasted the Bush administration's handling of the invasion and called for Defense Secretary Rumsfeld to be fired and the entire Pentagon leadership to be changed. He's also author of the book Squandered Victory, the American Occupation and the Bungled Effort to Bring Democracy to Iraq. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Larry Diamond, let's begin with you. Your response to this explosive Washington Post expose.
Well, good morning, Amy. It's nice to be with you again, and I would say I'm shocked. I am, even knowing that President Trump is new to national security matters, this is shocking, it's frightening, it's intolerable, and I think if we had a Democratic Congress, in itself, it would be grounds for an impeachment investigation.
Why?
Well, because even though it is literally true in this case that the president can declassify any information, he has done potentially, if the story is, I'd say, even substantially true, grave damage to U.S. national security by burning a major ally, by revealing, if the report is true, intelligence that was so sensitive we wouldn't even share it with an ally. Explain
what you mean by this is an ally's information and how the U.S. burned them.
Well, according to the reports, there was someone that one of our allies, presumably in the Middle East, you're now, in your reporting, suggesting it may be Jordan, which would be logical. It's one of our closest allies in the region. And it's right there near the center of gravity of ISIS, which is in Syria and Iraq. And they probably had a plant inside ISIS that was revealing this information. So they may have shared their intelligence agency with us, indicating, that it was of the most sensitive nature. People's lives could be at risk from this covert operation. I'm speculating, but it's a logical projection. And to share this not only beyond what they asked, but with a major adversary who is on the opposite side of this conflict in Syria, namely Russia, is, I think, breathtakingly irresponsible. And so either he did this in cavalier disregard for the rules and standard procedures and the sensitivity of such highly classified information, or if his tweet is correct and he decided that he should share this kind of information with Russia without, it appears, even consulting with his top national security officials. I mean, what's worse, gross incompetence, gross misjudgment, or possibly a confirmation of compromising ties with the Russians.
I want to go to what happened last night. At an emergency news conference Monday, the National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster, spoke for less than a minute and did not take any questions. He said the Washington Post story is reported as false, but he did not deny Trump may have disclosed classified information.
I just have a brief statement for the record. There's nothing that the president takes more seriously than the security of the American people. The story that came out tonight, as reported, is false. The president and the foreign minister reviewed a range of common threats to our two countries, including threats to civil aviation. At no time were intelligence sources or methods discussed. And the president did not disclose any military operations that were not already publicly known. Two other senior officials who were present, including the Secretary of State, remember the meeting the same way and have said so. Their on-the-record accounts should outweigh those of anonymous sources. And I was in the room. It didn't happen.
So that's National Security Advisor General McMaster. He was a colleague of yours here at Stanford University. What do you make of what he's saying?
Well, I think I can speak for my Hoover colleagues, at least the ones I know, in saying that, you know, he's widely respected and highly regarded by people at the Hoover Institution who've interacted with him, I'd say, over the last 14 or 15 years since he spent a year now. He's a very loyal and dedicated servant of our national security, and it pains me that he's having to go through this torture of justifying in a statement here that was, you will note, very carefully and specifically worded.
What do you mean by that?
He did not say that the president, as you just said, didn't reveal any sensitive information. He said he didn't reveal sources and methods, but what he revealed, if the Washington Post report is substantially accurate, what he revealed could enable a sophisticated adversary like Russia to deduce or infer sources and methods.
So, Professor Diamond, you come from a conservative institution here, the Hoover Institution, at Stanford University, with your colleague Condoleezza Rice, who you work with back in the Iraq War. At the time she sent you to Iraq, you called for Rumsfeld's resignation, a change of leadership, condemned what President Bush was doing in the Iraq War. What is the response of your colleagues at Hoover right now to President Trump?
Well, I'm not going to speak for my colleagues at Hoover. First of all, I can't speak for them collectively. I will say more generally, I know many Republicans and many conservatives who obviously said this man isn't fit to be president before he was elected, and whose concerns, I think, are being vividly confirmed on an almost daily basis now. And I'll just speak for myself in saying that I think we now have increasingly abundant and urgent evidence that this man is not fit to be president, is not fit to handle the national security challenges of the office, doesn't want to read and be briefed with anything like the depth or discipline that a president must, doesn't understand the burdens and sensitivities of these national security issues. And that's just speaking to his incompetence. We don't even know about the extent to which he may be compromised or his campaign may have been compromised by explicit ties with the Russians. And we have just last week, if you can believe it, the firing of the FBI director in what increasingly appears to have been an explicit effort to shut down the FBI investigation of his campaign's ties to the Russians. And I think it's only going to get worse.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion, and we'll be joined by Scott Horton, who's with Columbia Law School, though right now in London. This is Democracy Now! We're talking to Professor Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution here at Stanford University. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Take
Nobody's Truth by Pompeia here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Stanford University in Northern California as we continue to talk about the Washington Post's expose revealing how President Trump disclosed highly classified intelligence to Russian officials last week. I want to go to Donald Trump when he was campaigning for president. Here he is last September.
We also need the best protection of classified information. That is the worst situation. Hillary's private email scandal, which put our classified information in the reach of our enemies, disqualifies her from the presidency.
We're joined now by two guests. In London, Scott Horton's with us, lecturer at Columbia Law School, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine, author of Lords of Secrecy, The National Security Elite and America's Stealth Warfare. Still with me here at Stanford University is Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. Scott Horton, your response to, well, what President Trump said before he was president and what he reportedly talked to the Russians about the day after he fired the FBI director, James Comey.
Well, on one level, it's just a remarkable display of hypocrisy, of course. I mean, we have him pledging to be very cautious in the management of national security information, and criticizing his rival ruthlessly over this, and on the other hand, behaving in a very cavalier fashion with the most serious sorts of secrets. But I'd say both of these incidents, that is the investigation into the Clinton emails and the controversy now surrounding this meeting with Kislyak and Lavrov in the Oval Office, also serve to demonstrate an important feature of the way the classification system operates. That is, it exists to bind and tie those well down the list of authority. But as we approach the apex of the system, involving cabinet officers and the president and the vice president, there's actually much less constraint. The president has an absolute right to declassify anything. If he shares information, you could say it would be deemed declassified. So we can get out of the way immediately the question of illegality. So there's no illegality in what he's done, yet it may be a breathtaking betrayal. And going back to the things that Larry Diamond said, I think very correctly earlier, it does raise very fundamental questions about his judgment, and it does raise some legal issues, but they're at the highest level. They're at the level of legality that goes to his oath of office, his pledge to uphold the Constitution and laws and preserve, protect, and defend the United States, and that is impeachment territory.
So talk more about when this happened. What was it? A day after President Trump fired James Comey. So certainly very much in the spotlight. According to reports, even he was surprised at the level of blowback for his action. And then the pictures coming out at the White House of him, laughing with his Russian colleagues. Talk about the timing of this.
Well, that is the second most striking thing. I mean, that he agrees to have a meeting in the Oval Office where it's literally the only major scheduled event on his calendar the day after he has fired James Comey. And immediately after, he gave an interview to Lester Holt in which he acknowledged that he was firing Comey because, in the first instance, because of his concerns about the Russia probe that the FBI was carrying out. So I would say the visuals are astonishing. But then when we get into that meeting that occurred, notably with Sergei Kislyak, who, of course, is a leading Russian spy master in the United States, and Lavrov, who is the senior architect of President Putin's foreign policy. That meeting has occurred, allowing Russian media to come into the Oval Office while excluding American media. And then the whole flavor of that media, as was transmitted in that meeting, as it was transmitted in the Russian media, was jovial, gregarious, backslapping, friendly, open. That contrasts rather sharply with almost every meeting that Trump has had with major allies, with the Australian Prime Minister, with Angela Merkel, with Theresa May, and on and on and on. Those meetings have been touchy, difficult, usually have involved a great deal of friction and challenge. So I think it's fair for everybody to look at this contrast and ask what is going on here. And what marks this just extraordinary attitude that Trump has towards Russia, which in the Quadrennial Review is still viewed as America presenting the greatest security threat to the United States.
Part of this is about the U.S. and Russia having an alliance against ISIS. Is Trump being criticized through a Cold War lens here, Scott?
Well, I think we have to be careful about that, and there certainly is there's an element of that, and the criticism that comes up inside the Washington Beltway, particularly the criticism that comes from neocons. But I don't think that explains the problem altogether. I think when we look more closely at the situation in the Middle East, there's a context that has to be taken into account, and that is that Russia is very tightly aligned with Iran and with President Assad in Syria. And while we have mutual enemies, we also don't have the same friends, not by a long shot. There is a very, very clear friction and distance between the U.S. position and the Russian position throughout the region, and particularly in Syria. So I think if we step back, we would say that, pursuing a closer collaborative stance with Russia and operations in Syria, that's a perfectly fair thing to pursue. Sharing intelligence would be a reasonable thing to do in pursuing that relationship. But the way things occurred and are being reported now in the Washington Post is, nevertheless, it's shocking. It's, in a word, it's reckless.
You talked about impeachment territory. What exactly do you mean, and how do you see this possibly happening? Do you see this as the beginning of the end, Scott Horton, for the Trump presidency?
I think so. I talked about the oath a little bit earlier. So impeachment proceedings that have occurred historically when they involve the president, they always involve whether the president has satisfied or fulfilled his oath. That's taken as covering a number of different areas. And when the president behaves on the national security stage in a way that is reckless, shows little disregard for the security of the country, that's a fair question. So it becomes an issue for discussion in connection with impeachment proceedings. And I think I'd be surprised if we come to impeachment proceedings at some point, and I'd say the odds makers here in London are putting this now as a 50-50 proposition. If we get there, I think that this event, this meeting with Kislyak and Lavrov, is going to feature in the impeachment process and the bill of impeachment.
Larry Diamond, do you really see this happening in Washington with a Republican majority in the House and the Senate?
No, I see almost no prospect of it. I think either Trump would have to do something so massively criminal or dangerous that even the shockingly loyal Republican leadership, shocking in its loyalty to Trump, would defect, probably to save their own necks in advance of the midterm election. Or more likely, and keep in mind, this was certainly the pattern during Watergate, as you well know, Amy, it will only be when and if there is a Democratic Congress that the Congress is able to act to defend the Constitution.
But very conservative Republicans eventually, when it came to Nixon, said, no, this is a step too far.
Yeah, but it took a long time from the initial break-in at the Democratic headquarters in Washington, D.C., to the ultimate defection of enough Republicans to make it inevitable that Nixon was going to be convicted in the Senate if it went to trial. And, you know, even to the bitter end, a fair number of House Republicans voted not to impeach him.
So, Larry Diamond, your thoughts right now overall about the Trump administration and about the United States?
My thoughts are basically aligned with what Senator Corker said yesterday, and this could be a straw in the wind. He's a very respected guy. He's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Trump was considering him for Secretary of State. We're, in essence, in free fall here. And I think we're in free fall ethically, and I think we're in free fall in level of competence. And Amy, I was just thinking about the state of the world now. Go back to what all the news you read this morning about the ongoing civil strife in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we still have troop commitments and major historical stakes.
Where you spent a lot of time in Iraq.
Well, in Iraq, about raging civil wars, not only in Syria, but much less reported, and thank you for reporting it, in Yemen. The critical challenge of international terrorism represented by ISIS, and then there's also still al-Qaeda. The North Korean missile threat, which we haven't even talked about, but which is potentially with its nuclear program, an existential threat to the United States. And if you have a president who's incompetent and whose commitment to the Constitution is dubious and is not even willing to read more than a page of national security briefing memos, I'm not just outraged, I'm actually frightened for the national security of the United States.
Finally, President Trump will be meeting with the Turkish President Erdogan today at the White House. The president of Turkey just having pushed through a referendum that would increase his dictatorial powers. Much of Europe criticized this. President Trump called him and congratulated him. Mm-hmm. Talk about the significance of this meeting and this relationship. And do you think it has anything to do with the fact that President Trump has the twin Trump Towers in Istanbul?
I don't know. No, probably not, actually. I think it has more to do, and this is actually much more disturbing, with the fact that he has an open and consistent admiration for authoritarian leaders. Keep in mind that he's also invited to the White House, though fortunately so far it isn't scheduled, a meeting with Philippine President Duterte, who's presided over in less than a year in office the extrajudicial execution of over 7,000 people on the streets of the Philippines. And the backslapping joviality that Scott referred to with the Russian leaders seems to be a pattern with authoritarian leaders in general. A responsible American president might, in a low-profile way, talk to President Erdogan about our mutual national security, urgent interests in Syria and in the region, but raise open and serious concerns about the deteriorating human rights situation and the loss, we must say that, of democracy in Turkey. And no one should hold their breath that Donald Trump is going to spend 10 seconds raising concerns about that in his meeting with President Erdogan.
Finally, and we're just about to go to the Washington State Attorney General, but I wanted to get your comment on President Trump's latest tweet that happened during this broadcast. He said, "I've been asking Director Comey and others from the beginning of my administration to find the leakers in the intelligence community."
Well, I can only say thank God that people in the intelligence community feel a higher loyalty to the country than they do to the political position of the president.
Larry Diamond, thanks so much for being with us, senior fellow here at Stanford University at the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. And thanks so much to Scott Horton, a lecturer at Columbia Law School, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Seattle to talk to the Washington State Attorney General, Bob Ferguson. Stay with us.
And your love too.
Rescue Me by Fontella Bass, released on Chess Records. And our next guest is quite the chess player. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Monday, a federal appeals court in Seattle, Washington, heard arguments over Trump's second travel ban, which sought to prohibit all refugees and citizens of 6 majority Muslim nations from entering the United States. This is the second such court review this month. The panel of 3 judges appeared to be divided over the ban. Some questioned President Trump's attorneys whether the ban discriminates against Muslims. Others asked attorneys challenging the ban to justify why the court should interfere with Trump's presidential powers to determine national security policy. At Monday's hearing, senior judge Michael Hawkins of the Ninth Circuit questioned acting Solicitor General Jeffrey Wall.
Has the president ever disavowed his campaign statements? Has he ever stood up and said, I said before I wanted to ban all members of the Islamic faith from entering the United States of America. I was wrong. I've consulted with lawyers. I'm now addressing it simply to security needs. Has he ever said anything approaching that?
Yes, Judge Hawkins, he has said several things approaching that, and I think it's detailed in various amicus briefs. The best one is probably the Southeastern Legal Foundation brief, and Part 3 walks through the comments and shows that over time the president clarified that what he was talking about were Islamic terrorist groups and the countries that shelter or sponsor them. And over time, he and his advisors clarified that what he was focused on were groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda. And really the one post-inauguration statement they've got, the we all know what that means, I'd encourage the court to go back and look at the ceremony in which the president signed that executive order.
Outside the federal courthouse in Seattle, dozens of immigrant rights advocates rallied and waved signs saying no ban, no wall. The hearing came after a federal judge in Hawaii issued a nationwide halt to the order in March. A judge in Maryland also temporarily blocked the travel ban. The case is likely to go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is Trump's second attempt to roll out a nationwide Muslim ban. Well, we're joined for the remainder of the hour by the man who successfully blocked Trump's first attempt and ignited a legal firestorm of resistance, Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson. On January 28th, just a day after Trump issued his initial Muslim travel ban, Ferguson touched down at Seattle's SeaTac International Airport, where thousands of protesters were gathered in support of immigrants and refugees impacted by the ban. Ferguson and his team immediately jumped into action, filing lawsuits arguing Trump's order violated the Constitution. Less than 2 weeks later, a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit affirmed an order halting it. You could say it was checkmate for Trump's first travel ban by a former state chess champ. That's right. Ferguson is not only a state attorney general, but also an internationally rated chess master. For more, we go to Seattle, Washington, where we are joined by Washington's Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who recently made Time's list of 100 most influential people for successfully taking on Trump's travel ban. Ferguson is also one of the 20 state attorneys general calling for a special counsel investigation into Russia's role in last year's presidential election. Attorney General Bob Ferguson, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of the hearing that took place yesterday and why you jumped so quickly into action to challenge the travel ban that President Trump wanted to impose.
You bet. Hey, first, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And yesterday's hearing was really an extension that goes back to our challenge to the original travel ban. It touches on core constitutional issues, such as the limits of presidential power. And to answer your question about why we moved so quickly, you're right, the president signed the original travel ban, as you know, on a Friday evening. My team, we worked all of that weekend, and by Monday afternoon, we'd filed our complaint in federal court, and by that following Friday, had it struck down. So we worked so hard because we knew that every hour mattered. Folks are being turned away at airports all around the country. These are folks with travel visas, green cards, students at our colleges and universities. So the team really felt strongly that we had to move as quickly as we could because the executive order, frankly, was so overbroad and unconstitutional.
Is it true that you landed into the mass protest that was taking place, well, all over the country at airports, and for you at SeaTac at the Seattle International Airport?
Well, it's true I landed at SeaTac Airport midday on Saturday. That was the day where protests were occurring at airports. When I landed, the protests had not quite yet started, but I had phone calls when I landed from my team saying, hey, there's going to be a big press conference there at SeaTac Airport in just a couple hours. The governor, of course, was going to be there and others. And I was invited to stay for that press conference. I wanted to be there, of course, to show my support, but I really felt my time was best utilized by, frankly, getting back home, talking to my legal team, because the team was already hard at work at that point. We had attorneys who were canceling ski vacations, going back to the office to work around the clock that weekend, because we really knew we wanted to try and challenge this, frankly, unlawful executive order as quickly as we possibly could.
So what is your response to the hearing yesterday in the Ninth Circuit? How do you think it went?
Well, from my standpoint, the hearing has been pretty consistent with other hearings we've seen around the country and in hearings we saw with our original travel ban litigation. In other words, Donald Trump's statements from his campaign in which he called for a complete and total shutdown of Muslims coming into the United States, statements by his key advisors like Rudy Giuliani saying that the president was asking him to put together a commission to create a Muslim ban just to try and make it legal. Those statements are coming back to haunt the administration because they go to the intent behind both the original travel ban and the revised one. What the plaintiffs, what the states have to show is that a motivating factor behind the travel ban was an animus towards Muslims, and those statements are frankly fair game in establishing that intent.
I want to go back to Monday's hearing. This is Attorney Neil Katyal, who represents the state of Hawaii, speaking at the Ninth Circuit hearing.
We wouldn't be standing here if it was just campaign statements on its own, but as the district court found, the president rekindled those statements through his actions as president in two different respects. First, when he issued the first executive order, he read the title of the executive order, looked up at the camera and said, we all know what that means. That's at SCR 148. And that is, if it was clear from the title what it meant, he wouldn't have had to say it. It's a reference to something else. And indeed, when he issued both executive orders, he left on his website that very statement about the complete and total shutdown of Muslims, a statement that just happened to disappear moments before the Fourth Circuit argument last week. So I think the question is, what would an objective observer view these statements as? And as the district court found, it would view them as an establishment of a disfavored religion of Islam.
So that's Attorney Neil Katyal. Bob Ferguson, Attorney General of Washington, your response?
Yeah, I think he's got it spot on. And as I mentioned before, Rudy Giuliani, when I mentioned his quote about the president asking him, Rudy Giuliani, to create a commission to create a Muslim ban, those words came after Donald Trump was president. So these statements, it's not a one-off from one campaign event back many months ago. There's a pattern of comments from the president himself and his key advisors making very clear what they want to do. And frankly, every federal judge so far that's looked at this case, from the original travel ban to the revised one, whether those are federal judges appointed by Democratic presidents or Republican presidents, have all agreed that the injunction must be in place and that the travel ban cannot go forward.
Let's go to the former New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, close ally of President Trump, speaking on Fox News.
I'll tell you the whole history of it. So when he first announced it, he said Muslim ban. He called me up. He said, put a commission together. Show me the right way to do it legally. I put a commission together with Judge Mukasey, with Congressman McCall, Pete King, a whole group of other very expert lawyers on this. And what we did was we focused on, instead of religion, danger. The areas of the world that create danger for us, which is a factual basis, not a religious basis. Perfectly legal, perfectly sensible, and that's what the ban is based on. It's not based on religion. It's based on places where there are substantial evidence that people are sending terrorists into our country.
So it's not based on religion, says Rudolph Giuliani. It's based on danger, Attorney General Bob Ferguson.
Yeah, I mean, contrary to his own words, right? He said the president literally called him up and said, create a Muslim ban, just make it legal. What we would submit is that that can't be done. You can't say you're going to have a Muslim ban and try and make that legal. That violates our Constitution. And multiple federal judges have came to the same conclusion. Also, on this sort of latter point of his comments there, it's worth pointing out that Homeland Security issued a report. Early on, we had our battle over the first executive order. Homeland Security issued a report saying that nation of origin is a poor way to determine who comes into the country if what you're concerned about, frankly, is national security. We had the former CIA director of George W. Bush support our litigation against the travel ban, saying that the travel ban was bad for national security. Frankly, there's been more evidence in the record of these cases that the travel ban is a bad idea for national security rather than a good one.
Attorney General Bob Ferguson, President Trump called the judge who stayed the ban in your state, Washington, a so-called judge. And then Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General of the United States, just said 2 weeks ago on a right-wing radio talk show, talking about the Hawaiian judge, the federal judge in Hawaii who stayed the second travel ban. How is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States? Your comments.
Well, it's frankly hard to know where to start. Both comments are deeply offensive, I think, to the judiciary and the rule of law. I guess what I would point out for your audience is that I didn't hear then-Senator Sessions complaining when President Barack Obama issued his executive order on immigration reform, and the Texas Attorney General, a Republican, filed a lawsuit challenging that executive order, and a federal judge in Texas struck it down nationwide. I didn't hear folks complaining then when a single federal judge could strike down an entire executive order by a president on immigration issues. They're complaining now, frankly, because they lost, but they only have themselves to blame. The executive order that was rolled out was sloppy. They were not communicating with their key agencies. It was blatantly unconstitutional, gave folks no warning at all. So I'm not surprised that they're losing, but it is unfortunate that they can't simply go to work on trying to find a constitutional way to keep our nation safe rather than criticizing federal judges who are deeply respected by lawyers across the country.
You know, we were just in Seattle, and I was wondering if you could talk about the significance of Washington State leading the way on this challenge to the Muslim ban, I mean, so-called by Donald Trump when he was running for president, and also the history of Washington State when it comes to the Japanese internment camps in World War II.
Well, you raise a really important part of our history and a really obviously sad and disturbing part of our history, which relates to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. That's a history that we live with out here on the West Coast and in Washington State specifically. And as a child growing up in Washington State, that's a history that I learned about, that I heard about from my parents, and is obviously something we've learned from and do not want to repeat. I might also add that one of our Republican governors, Dan Evans, was a very prominent governor of ours in the 60s and 70s. Back after the Vietnam War, he was really the first and most prominent governor in the entire country to welcome Vietnamese individuals fleeing Vietnam after the war and needing to settle in the United States. Very few governors wanted to welcome them to their communities. Dan Evans, a Republican governor, most certainly did. He was a leader in that regard. So I think our history has both a disturbing past that we've learned from. I think that's helped both Republicans and Democratic leaders of our state over the years to come to terms with that history and learn from it and try and improve upon it.
Attorney General Bob Ferguson, you're among the state attorneys general who are calling for a special counsel into the Russia probe, the probe of whether Russia in any way was colluding with the Trump administration over interference in the 2016 election. Why are you calling for a special counsel?
Well, it's needed, my goodness. I mean, having the President of the United States fire the FBI director who's in the middle of investigation regarding Russian interference related to the President's key advisors, to take an action like that is frankly shocking from a constitutional sense. And so what needs to happen is that independent investigation needs to go on, and frankly, a special prosecutor is the path to do it. I think one key aspect of this that we see from the President is he does these outlandish actions. It's an executive order on a Muslim ban or firing the FBI director. I think the key to success in taking the President on and restoring the rule of law is put him in a forum that he is frankly going to be on the defensive and not as comfortable, and that's the courtroom. That's through a special prosecutor. You can't tweet your way out of an investigation from a special prosecutor. You can't tweet your way out of a courtroom. What matters there is the Constitution. That's why I feel so strongly that special independent prosecutor is so badly needed.
In April, President Trump ordered a review of national monuments, potentially opening up millions of acres of public lands to drilling, mining, and logging. Trump said his executive order was aimed at reversing President Obama's use of the 1906 Antiquities Act to protect federal land from development. This is what he said.
The Antiquities Act does not give the federal government unlimited power to lock up millions of acres of land and water, and it's time we ended this abusive practice.
Attorney General Bob Ferguson, earlier this month, you sent a letter to the Secretary of Interior, Ryan Zinke, voicing your concern about the potential rollback of national monument protections ordered by President Donald Trump. Can you explain?
Absolutely. Donald Trump is the first president since Teddy Roosevelt to take the view that somehow he alone, the president, can roll back these protections for, frankly, some of our most beautiful places that we have in the United States. It's our view that he's wrong on the law, and it's wrong from a policy standpoint as well. We, of course, are focused on the law. I've asked my legal team to go to work on it because here in Washington State, we have a couple of those national monuments that could fall under the broad interpretation of this executive order that he's issued. We want to stop that in its tracks. Once again, to my earlier point, I think, frankly, the way to confront and take on this president is to take him to the courtroom, right? That is where it's a level playing field. That's where the rule of law prevails. And I'm confident that if they go forward with trying to roll back protections for national monuments, they will lose once again in the courts.
Finally, we only have 30 seconds, but your state has just legalized recreational marijuana. Can you respond to the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, wanting to crack down, intensify the war on drugs?
You bet. Governor Jay Inslee from Washington State and myself sent a letter to Attorney General Sessions 2 or 3 months ago explaining why we think marijuana legalization should be allowed to move forward here in Washington and asking for a meeting. We've not heard back yet.
Well, Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson, I want to thank you very much for joining us from Seattle, Washington. And that does it for today's program. Tonight, I'll be speaking in San Diego at St. Paul's Cathedral at 7 p.m. On Wednesday, I'll be in Los Angeles for a benefit for KPFK, Pacifica Radio, at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church, 7 p.m. Then on Thursday at noon in Los Angeles at Skylight Books, and at 7 p.m. in Santa Barbara at La Casa de la Raza. And on Friday, we'll be in Santa Fe, New Mexico at the James A. Little Theater at 7. On Saturday, we'll be in Tempe, Arizona at Changing Hands in the evening, celebrating KPFT in Houston, Texas. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis, Diener. Happy birthday, Aaron Dooley, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.